Okay, class, straight from the studios of Howard Sokol Productions comes Chapter 17, Part 3, where again, we're still talking about limited liability companies, or LLCs. And on this slide, we're talking about piercing the veil of an LLC. And I already talked about one circumstance where that can be done, and that's where you don't follow the requirements. Let me diverge here for a second to explain a little bit more about that. One of the problems that happens is people hear that they can avoid personal liability by making their business an LLC or a corporation or some similar form of business. So they go to a lawyer, they have all the paperwork done, they go home, their business is now an LLC, but they're still operating like they were a sole proprietorship. Their truck doesn't have anything indicating that it's an LLC. It still uses the same previous name. Their paperwork, like their invoices, their telephone advertisements, everything is similar. That is the type of thing that can lead to the piercing of the veil, and why it's very important that once you have established yourself as this type of business, that you operate as that type of business. And for corporations, and to some extent LLCs, there are requirements under the statutes, depending upon the state, that you have things like meetings, that you keep minutes of your meetings, and those kind of things. And if you don't do those, you're subject to that piercing of the veil. And this is one other situation when you use your company to defraud creditors. That can also be a situation where you are have the veil pierced. But the case in your book, Bonner versus Brunson, was a situation where the court looked at the facts of the case and said that there was not enough variance to act outside the scope of an LLC, and therefore refused to pierce the veil. All right, now what about doing business in foreign states? This parallels corporation or corporate law, and that is you are authorized to do business in the state in which your LLC was formed and accepted by the Secretary of State. To do business in another state, you have to be recognized by that state, and you have to get what's called a certificate of authority. It's not a difficult thing. Most states simply require that you fill out a form and send to the Secretary of State of that foreign state a certificate from your Secretary of State saying that you're an LLC, pay a fee, provide the form, and then you can operate as a foreign LLC doing business in that state. Okay, why is that important? Well, at least with corporate law, and I believe it's also true with LLCs, if you don't do that and you operate in another state, then your operation in that other state may be determined to be non-applicable to corporate law. In other words, you'd be treated as a sole proprietor and you would lose your cover of liability. So if you're going to do business more than like a one-time shot in another state, you need to make sure that you are recognized as a foreign limited liability company in those states in which you intend to do business. Okay, so I talked about the IRS check the box in a previous part of Chapter 17. And basically that law changed in 97. I think I said 87 before. In 97, they changed the rule and allowed for tax treatment to be like partnerships. Okay. Now, moving on. Now we've talked about LLCs. Now most states have expanded LLCs to allow for what's called professional limited liability companies. In some states you can be a regular LLC and be a professional entity. In some states you have to be a professional LLC only, and they vary slightly perhaps. And that usually applies to people like doctors, lawyers, and professionals. Now what makes it different with regard to these professions is that the members all have to be of that profession. Okay? So for example, if you're going to operate a law firm as an LLC, all the members have to be lawyers. The main reason for that, at least with regard to lawyers, is ethics. Okay? Because lawyers are bound by a code of professional ethics. If you have an LLC that allows members who are non-lawyers, and they have a vote in what you can do and what you can't do, they could vote for doing things that would be unethical for the lawyers. So that's why we restrict the membership to people of that profession. Now, you're always liable for your own acts of negligence, but as with, but the limitation of liability for LLCs and professional LLCs does not make you liable for anything that would be vicarious liability that we talked about before. Another form of limited liability is the form of a limited liability partnership. These are recognized in many states, including Georgia, and so now there are a lot of professional organizations that operate as limited liability partnerships. It's usually limited to professionals, again like lawyers and doctors, who would normally do business as partners in a partnership. The taxation is like a partnership. The difference here usually with limited liability partnerships is you have to register with the Secretary of State, and so that the public is on notice that you're operating as an LLP, and that's important so that people know that if you're an LLP and they're doing business with you, that the business may not have, the members may not have personal liability, and so that's a choice that a customer would have to make. You have to comply with state statutes, and you have to include limited liability partnership or LLP. By the way, I didn't have a slide on, but with an LLC, that's also extremely important. Your name has to say either LLC or limited liability company, and you have to use that on everything where you use your name in order to keep from having the veil pierced. Okay. All right. There's also another form of limited liability business, and that's the family limited liability partnership, which is limited to people in the same family. And you can see the how that works. You'd have to look into that more in a particular state that you're in, but I did want to mention this as one of these other growths in the process of different forms of business. So that ends part 3 of chapter 14. Again, the magic word for this chapter is management.